New Town, Edinburgh, winter 2016. The late afternoon sun filtered through the bay windows of the old Georgian house on Northumberland Street, casting long golden shadows across the patterned rug in the parlor. Dust motes drifted lazily in the amber light like tiny ghosts of music long faded. Amara Layton stood at the threshold of the room, her fingers resting lightly on the worn frame of the French door. Her breath caught for just a second. The Steinway Grand was gone. In its place sat a minimalist white credenza, its sleek lines sterile and cold against the wood-paneled walls. Where once there had been shelves of manuscripts and vinyl records collected by her mother over decades, there now hung 3 abstract paintings, all white, gray, and silver, like something from a modern hotel lobby. Celeste redecorated, I see, Amara murmured, more to herself than to the silence. She stepped into the room slowly, as though afraid to disturb the dust or perhaps the past. Her boots clicked softly against the hardwood floor that had once been warmed by thick velvet curtains and the sounds of Chopin or Brahms. She remembered lying on that rug as a child, eyes closed, as her mother played Debussy on Sunday mornings. The music would wrap around her like a soft quilt, and the scent of bergamot from her mother's tea would mix with the wood polish that her father insisted be used weekly. Now it smelled like nothing. From the hallway, a faint clinking of china floated in. Someone, probably Celeste, was preparing tea. Amara didn't care to join. Instead, her gaze fell upon the lone relic that remained, a framed black and white photograph of her parents on their wedding day. Her mother in a lace gown, her eyes as soft as her touch. Her father looking at her like he was seeing music take form. Amara picked up the frame and brushed a thumb over her mother's cheek. "I'm sorry, Mum," she whispered. "I didn't think it would change this much." She turned the photo over, expecting nothing, but her heart skipped as a small envelope slid out from behind the frame. Her name was written on it in cursive, in her mother's hand, clear, elegant, unhurried. Her knees gave way before she realized she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the envelope trembling in her hands. It was sealed with wax, something her mother used to do for birthday cards, just for the drama of it. Amara broke it open carefully. "Dearest Amara, if you are reading this, it means you've come back home. I don't know how much has changed. I hope not too much. But if it has, I want you to remember one thing. Music is memory. You and I shared a language no one else spoke. Do you remember that rainy afternoon in June when the roof leaked, and the electricity went out, and we lit candles and played music by memory? You were 12, and you played with such soul it made me cry. Whatever happens, wherever life takes you, I hope you keep that part of yourself alive. Not in spite of pain, but because of it. Love always." The paper slipped from her fingers as she drew her knees to her chest and folded forward, burying her face. The sobs came soundless at first, like a tight string snapping in a quiet room. She did remember that afternoon. How the storm had howled outside, the windows rattling, the sky iron gray. And how her mother had struck the first chord of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata with a trembling finger, smiling at her as if inviting her into a secret only they knew. "I'll play first movement, you take second," her mother had said. They had played in candlelight. No sheet music, just memory and trust. Amara was pulled from the memory by the distant echo of high heels on marble. The footsteps were too poised, too precise. "Amara?" Celeste's voice called from the hallway. "Are you in the music room?" Amara inhaled, wiped her face, and stood up. She pocketed the letter, leaving the envelope by the photo frame, its wax seal cracked like her composure. "I am," she called back. Celeste entered a moment later, holding a tray with a teapot and 2 porcelain cups. Her auburn hair was coiled elegantly at the nape of her neck, and she wore a silk blouse the color of rose ash. Her expression was perfectly neutral, that vaguely theatrical poise of a woman who had long learned how to perform elegance. "I thought you might want tea," she said. "Chamomile. You used to like that." Amara gave a noncommittal nod and sat on the edge of the chaise, one of the few pieces that looked original. "You got rid of the Steinway." Celeste didn't flinch. "It was old. Cracked soundboard. Beyond repair." "It belonged to my mother," Amara said, voice low. "It belonged to the house. We needed space." "We?" The word cut the air like a discordant note. Or youth. Celeste paused in pouring the tea. For the briefest moment, her fingers trembled. Then she finished the pour and handed Amara a cup. It's not healthy to live in the past, darling. Your father and I thought. No, Amara interrupted, standing. You thought. Dad just agreed. There was a stillness. A teacup clicked gently onto porcelain. Amara's eyes burned, but her voice steadied. You changed everything. You stripped it all down to cold white walls and steel light fixtures. You erased her. She was gone, Amara. No, Amara said sharply. She died. That's not the same as being gone. Celeste's mouth tensed. Her shoulders straightened with that same violinist's discipline. I'm sorry if it feels like I took something from you, she said finally, and for once, her voice held a trace of sincerity. Amara studied her for a long beat. Then she reached into her coat pocket and placed the folded letter on the table between them. She left this behind. For me. Not you. Celeste didn't reach for it. She looked at the wax seal, broken and faded, then back at Amara with something that might have been regret, or fear, or nothing at all. I'm going to restore what I can, Amara said quietly. I can't bring her back. But I won't let you erase her either. She turned and walked toward the door, stopping only once to run her hand along the molding near the baseboard, a little carved heart, barely visible, that her father had etched there the week she was born. Outside, the sun had all but set. The street lamps flickered on across Newtown, and the sky blushed its last note of color before nightfall. Inside her coat, the letter pulsed like a second heartbeat. Music is memory, and Amara would never forget. Vienna, winter 2021. The snow was falling outside in a slow, hushed rhythm, like a conductor holding each flake in suspense before letting it land. From her apartment window overlooking the Praterstrasse, Amara watched the world blur into muted grays and whites. Inside, a kettle hissed softly, waiting to boil. Mahler's Adagietto played low on the turntable, its longing strings filling the space like a ghost pacing the walls. Amara sat cross-legged on the floor, her violin in hand, bow balanced across her knee. She hadn't played all morning. She couldn't. The letter sat on the counter, still unopened. Her father's handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, rigid but elegant, each stroke formed with architectural precision. The return address, Newtown, Edinburgh. He hadn't written in over a year. She stood, picked up the envelope, and ran her finger along the flap. The seal cracked with a sound that felt louder than it should have been in the quiet. Dearest Amara, I'll be in Salzburg for a few days next week. There's a performance at the Mozarteum, and I'll be attending as a guest of the Philharmonic. If you're willing, I'd very much like to see you. Just a coffee. No music. No lectures. Just your old man. Her heart beat in a minor key. They met at Café Tomaselli 3 days later, in the shadow of Mozart's former residence. The café hadn't changed in a century. Crystal chandeliers, waiters in black waistcoats, the sharp scent of dark-roasted coffee and powdered sugar. Amara spotted him by the window. Benjamin Layton, silver-haired, sharply dressed in his usual wool coat and silk scarf. He was thinner than she remembered. He stood as she approached, hesitating before reaching out. She accepted the embrace, brief, formal. You look well, he said, smiling too tightly. You look, she paused, then chose the safer word, tired. He chuckled softly. That's fair. They ordered, coffee for him, black, tea for her, chamomile. She sipped in silence as he looked out the window, almost like he was waiting for something, some cue to begin a difficult movement. I imagine you're wondering why I wrote, he said finally. I figured you wanted something. The edge in her voice surprised them both. Benjamin looked down, ashamed. She sighed, setting the cup aside. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. No, he said, it was. She studied him. His hands, once strong and precise with a baton, now trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted his cup. His cheekbones were more pronounced, his skin paler than usual. He folded his hands, then looked up and met her eyes. I have cancer, Amara. The words hung in the air like a suspended cord, unresolved. Liver, he added. Stage 4. She didn't speak for a long time. She just sat there, her pulse in her ears, her breath suddenly caught somewhere in her ribs. Did you just find out? She asked. I've known for 6 months. Her jaw clenched. And you're only telling me now? I wanted to be sure. Of the diagnosis. Of how I felt about telling you. You mean of how you felt about seeing me again, she said quietly. He gave a small, sad nod. There was silence again, but it wasn't the kind that separated. It was thick, heavy, pressing them closer without permission. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. Not for what happened with your mother. Or with Celeste. Or with you. But I'd like to make peace if it's not too late. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, not thick, just a few pages, and slid it across the table to her. What is this? A score. One I never published. Never even showed to Celeste. I wrote it after your mother died. She picked it up slowly, carefully peeling back the cover. The title, she whispered, her voice catching. For the girl in the second movement. He smiled gently. Do you remember that storm in '09? When the power went out and you played Rachmaninoff in candlelight? I do, she said, voice almost inaudible. You told me I played with more soul that night than I had in years. It was the first time since her funeral that I felt like there was music in the house again. Amara blinked back tears. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page. The handwriting was unmistakable, his fluid and neat, markings precise, notations filled with emotion instead of control. It wasn't a perfect composition, it was raw. Human. I want you to have it, he said. And if I don't make it, I want you to give it to Greaves, my lawyer. He'll know what to do. She looked up, confused. There's more than music in that score, he added. It's part of the trust paperwork. The original trust your mother and I created. Celeste doesn't know it exists. Amara narrowed her eyes. He chuckled again, this time with a little more life. Surprised? So was I, when I remembered we had done it back in '95. It was for the house, the instruments, your future. I left it untouched all these years. Why not tell me sooner? Because I wasn't ready to let go. Not of her. Not of the guilt. And because part of me was still trying to live in 2 worlds. One where I was the husband who never moved on, and one where I was just a man trying to survive. His voice softened. But now, I'm out of time to be in between. Amara stared at the folder again, the music inside, the history beneath it. It was the first time he had acknowledged what they lost, what she had lost. And somehow, in that bustling Viennese cafe, surrounded by the clang of silverware and the hum of tourists, they found quiet. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Okay, she whispered. We'll figure it out. Together. He exhaled shakily, and for a moment he looked like the father she had once known, the one who had lifted her up after every recital, whose voice hummed lullabies while she fell asleep on his shoulder backstage. When they stood to leave, she helped him into his coat without speaking. Outside, the snow was still falling, a blanket of soft forgiveness covering the rooftops. That night, Amara placed the score on her music stand and lit 3 candles around the room. She tucked her chin under the violin and began to play. The first few measures were clumsy, hands cold, eyes blurry, but as the melody unfolded, so did the memories. She could see her mother by the piano, her father behind the conductor's stand, and herself, just a girl in the second movement, finding her place in the music again. Each note stitched something back together. And when she reached the final bar, her bow lifted gently, trembling. There was no applause. Just the silence of understanding. And the echo of a father's love, restored, one note at a time. New Town, Edinburgh, Spring 2022. The brass knocker struck the oak door with a sound far too heavy for such a quiet morning. Amara stood motionless on the stoop, her violin case hanging from one shoulder, a folded letter crumpled in her hand. It was early, not yet 7 a.m., but the pinkish light was already stretching across the Georgian rooftops of New Town, painting them in hues too gentle for what she expected to find behind this door. The locks clicked, then turned. Celeste's face appeared, framed perfectly in the doorway like a portrait painted with elegance and control. Not a strand of her auburn hair was out of place. "Amara," she said, smiling without warmth. "This is unexpected." "I wrote you 3 days ago," Amara replied coolly. "I said I was coming." "Yes, but you didn't say when." Celeste stepped aside stiffly. "Your father is resting." Amara crossed the threshold. "He won't be resting for long." The scent of the house hit her first, not the scent she remembered. Gone was the faint musk of sheet music, pipe tobacco, and old polished wood. In its place, citrus diffusers and something artificial and sweet, like high-end antiseptic. As she passed the drawing room, her eyes caught the void where the grandfather clock once stood, replaced now with a sleek white sculpture that looked more like a question mark than art. She stopped at the base of the staircase, tightening her grip on the banister. "Celeste," she said over her shoulder, "where's the Steinway?" There was a pause. "Sold," came the reply. "It wasn't being used." Amara inhaled slowly, like she was swallowing a scream. "It wasn't a couch." "No," Celeste said, her heels clicking as she moved toward the kitchen. "But it was taking up space." The master bedroom had been converted into a medical ward. Amara stood at the doorway, her chest tightening as she took in the sight. Her father, the once indomitable Benjamin Layton, lay shrunken beneath a pale blanket. His face was hollowed, sunken in around his cheekbones. A tube snaked under his nose. His hands trembled slightly with every breath. But his eyes still carried the light of someone who once led entire orchestras with just a raised brow. "Dad?" she whispered. He turned slowly, eyes blinking to adjust. Then a smile, fragile but unmistakably his, tugged at his lips. "Mara," he rasped. She rushed forward, kneeling beside the bed and taking his hand. It was like holding parchment, thin, cold, too easily torn. "I came as soon as I got your note," she said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad." "I tried to tell you earlier," he said, breath shallow. "But Celeste said you were busy, preparing for your audition." Amara's face darkened. "Dad, you're dying. There is no concert more important than this." He tried to chuckle, but it turned into a wheezing cough. She reached for the water glass on his nightstand and lifted it to his lips. He drank with effort. "I'm glad you're here," he said, eyes closing. At that moment, Celeste stepped into the room. Amara turned her head sharply. "You told him I wouldn't come?" she asked. Celeste raised an eyebrow. "He didn't need stress. You haven't exactly been emotionally delicate with him lately." "That's not your decision to make," Amara hissed. "You kept his diagnosis from me. You isolated him." "I protected him." "You controlled him," she shot back. The room went still except for the low hum of the oxygen machine. Benjamin opened his eyes again, slowly. "Enough, both of you." Amara took a breath, steadying herself. "Dad, is it true? Have you been signing documents?" He blinked, then turned his eyes toward Celeste, who looked suddenly stiff, almost frozen. "I've seen your signature on financial transfers," Amara continued. "Large ones. Accounts being moved. Assets being sold." He nodded faintly. "Said it was necessary. For care. For ease." "Did you read what you signed?" she asked. There was a long silence. He didn't answer. That was all she needed to hear. Amara stood and crossed the room to the dresser, the one thing Celeste hadn't replaced. She opened the top drawer and reached beneath the old wool scarves her mother used to fold there. Her hand felt a familiar shape, a leather-bound folder, nearly flat. She pulled it out, opened the clasp, and found exactly what she feared and hoped. A trust document, dated 1995. Signed by Benjamin and her mother. Her name was there in black ink. Beneficiary. So, she turned back to her father. "Did you remember this existed?" He gave the faintest of nods. "And Celeste?" "She doesn't know," he whispered. A shift in the air. Celeste moved forward. "You have no right to." Amara raised her hand. "Stop." Her voice was firm, almost calm. Too calm. "This is between me and my father. You've had years to play curator of this house. But not anymore. Celeste's jaw tensed. You won't touch another document, Amara said. Not without me, not again. She turned back to Benjamin, softer now. We'll talk to Greaves tomorrow. We'll activate the trust. You won't have to worry. Benjamin nodded again, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. I'm sorry, he murmured, for letting it get this far. She knelt again, squeezing his hand. I'm here now. He looked at her like a drowning man finally catching a breath. That evening, Amara sat alone in the old study, a small lamp casting amber light over stacks of legal folders and aged sheet music. The oxygen machine hissed softly in the background down the hall. On the desk sat the original score her father had written for her, for the girl in the second movement. She ran her fingers over the staff lines, tracing notes like she was reading his heartbeat. From the corner of the room, she pulled out her violin, tuned it slowly, and brought it to her chin. Her bow hovered for a long moment. Then, with a breath, she began to play. The melody was simple, aching, unresolved. But somewhere in the middle of the second movement, the tone shifted, not toward triumph, but toward truth, toward stillness. As if the composer, like the father, had found a moment of peace. And so did she. Edinburgh, late spring 2022. The scent of lilies was overwhelming. Too strong, too sweet, as if the blooms were trying to drown out the truth with their insistence on beauty. Amara stood near the back of St. Cuthbert's Church, her hands folded tightly in front of her, fingers white from pressure. Her black dress, plain, silk-lined, long-sleeved, felt like a contradiction in the midst of the spectacle before her. The casket, polished mahogany, gleamed under the harsh lights of the cathedral stage. A spotlight, an actual spotlight, illuminated it from above. Behind it, a string quartet played Vivaldi with mechanical perfection, their movements synchronized like clockwork dancers. A floral arch spiraled toward the ceiling, adorned with imported orchids and gold-tipped ivy. And in the front pew, Celeste sat like a crowned widow, dressed in dramatic black lace, a netted veil across her face, lips pressed into a practiced pout of sorrow. Her handkerchief was monogrammed. Her posture, impeccable. Amara hadn't spoken a word since stepping inside. Benjamin Layton, composer, conductor, father, had passed away 2 nights ago, just after midnight. Amara had been holding his hand, seated at his bedside in the quiet of their home. No oxygen machine, no nurses hovering, just the two of them and the soft, final movement of a life slowly letting go. He had whispered her name once before his chest fell still. She had kissed his temple and stayed beside him until the sky began to lighten. Now, standing amid pews filled with unfamiliar faces, record label executives, socialites, critics, investors, Amara felt like an intruder at her own father's funeral. This wasn't for him. This was for them. For Celeste. When the first eulogy began, a 10-minute tribute from an arts philanthropist who had never met her father outside galas, Amara lowered her head and closed her eyes. Her memories didn't come in linear form. They arrived like music, dissonant, overlapping, half-formed yet vivid. Her father's fingers guiding hers across the keys of their piano when she was 5. The whistle he gave when she passed her conservatory audition. His tired eyes the night he missed her senior recital. The soft apology he whispered only once, years too late. And then, that final night. He had been so quiet. No gasping, no struggle. Just a gentle exhale. The kind of breath a conductor releases between movements. She remembered the feel of his hand in hers, cool, weightless, yet tethered to everything. She remembered brushing the white hairs back from his forehead and whispering, "It's okay, Dad. I've got you now." And she remembered the silence that followed. Not empty, just still. Now, please welcome the widow, Celeste Layton. Applause. At a funeral. Amara blinked, stunned. Celeste stood, walked toward the pulpit, and removed her veil with a theatrical slowness that belonged on stage. She began with a story about Benjamin's larger-than-life presence, about his gift to the world, about his vision for grandeur. He hated anything ordinary, Celeste said, voice tremoring with false intimacy. He demanded brilliance, demanded attention. He would have loved this. Amara's stomach clenched. He wouldn't have. Benjamin Layton had conducted in silence before every rehearsal. He ate alone on concert days to collect his thoughts. He refused curtain calls beyond the first. He told Amara, on more than one occasion, music is not about show. It's about presence. And here he was, center stage, reduced to spectacle. Amara couldn't sit through another second. She slipped out of the side aisle and into the church's vestry, pushing open a narrow wooden door that led to the chapel's modest music room. It smelled like wax, old sheet music, and the kind of grief that doesn't require applause. There, in the corner, stood an upright piano. Her heart pulled toward it instinctively. She sat on the bench, her fingers hovering just above the keys. And then she played. Not a full sonata, not even a structured piece. Just fragments, themes her father had once hummed in the kitchen, cadences from lullabies he wrote in margins, the unfinished phrases from For the Girl in the second movement. Each note felt like a confession. Gentle. Unapologetic. She didn't know how long she played, only that at some point, the music in the main cathedral had stopped. Footsteps approached. The door creaked open. A young usher stood there, awkwardly. "They're asking if you'd like to say a few words," he said. She looked up. Then she stood. When she returned to the altar, the audience shifted. Whispers, confusion. Celeste looked surprised, and perhaps for the first time, nervous. Amara took no notes to the podium. No rehearsed speech. She placed both hands on the wood. "My father was a quiet man," she began, voice clear. Not silent, just intentional. He didn't need bright lights or curated stories to be meaningful. She paused, breath steady. What he loved was subtlety, honesty. Music played softly in the background while we ate toast. The creak of our front door. The rhythm of rain. The room had stilled. "I held his hand when he died," she continued. "He didn't ask for applause. He didn't need spotlights. He asked me to remember. And I will." She looked directly at Celeste. "Some memorials are loud. Some are quiet. But the loudest one I can think of is this." She pulled a folded sheet from her coat, the final page of his unfinished score, and it ends in pianissimo. She stepped down without waiting for a response. That evening, Amara returned to the house. It was quiet now. The florists had taken their displays. The string quartet had gone. The gold-plated programs left behind in a neat stack by the fireplace. She climbed the stairs to her father's study. The door creaked open. On the desk was the leather folder. Inside, the trust confirmation, the deed to the house, and one more thing, a small, handwritten note. This house was never hers to give away. It was always yours to return to. Her throat tightened. Outside, the city of Edinburgh exhaled its evening hush. Church bells tolled in the distance. She stood in the window, watching the lights flicker on across rooftops, one by one, like candles in a concert hall. And there, in the solitude of twilight, the real funeral happened, not in marble cathedrals, not under chandeliers, but in memory, in presence, in love. A requiem not of trumpets, but of truth. Edinburgh, early summer 2022. The reading of the will was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, in the oak-paneled office of Barrister Greaves and Company, tucked along a cobblestone lane in the West End. The sky was overcast, and the air carried the cool, damp scent of early rain on stone. Amara arrived 15 minutes early. She always did when it mattered. She wore no makeup. Her hair was tied back in a clean bun, her black coat tailored and quiet. She clutched a leather-bound notebook in one hand and the envelope her father left her in the other, still unopened. The receptionist led her through a tall door into a room filled with cold politeness and inherited tension. Celeste was already seated. Draped in charcoal silk and pearls, she perched at the head of the conference table like a queen anticipating her coronation. Her manicured fingers rested delicately on a leather purse. A faint smirk tugged at her lips, the kind that betrayed satisfaction barely contained. "Amara," she said without turning her head. "How lovely you could join us." Amara sat opposite. "You always did love a stage." Celeste's eyes glittered. Some performances deserve proper endings. Before Amara could reply, the door creaked open again. In walked Harrison Greaves, tall, bald, with tortoiseshell glasses and the grave expression of a man who'd read too many secrets. He nodded once. "Shall we begin?" The will, as read aloud by Greaves, was brief and brutal. "I, Benjamin Layton, being of sound mind and will, do hereby bequeath the following." Celeste straightened as the list began. "To my wife, Celeste Layton, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all property, accounts, and intellectual rights, to be used at her discretion." Celeste gave a breathless little laugh, a gasp disguised as grief. Amara sat motionless. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes never left Celeste's face. "And to my daughter, Amara Layton." The pause. "I leave my personal violin, a 19th-century French instrument, stored in the music room cabinet. It is my hope that she will continue the legacy of music we once shared." That was it. No house. No royalties. No manuscript archives. No mention of the trust. Nothing but an old violin. Greaves folded the paper with ceremonial finality. "That concludes the reading." Celeste rose slowly, triumphant. She turned toward Amara with exaggerated sympathy. "I know it's not what you expected," she purred. "But your father wanted peace. And closure." Amara said nothing. Celeste moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to add, "You're welcome to visit the violin before I begin renovations. But make it quick." Then she was gone. Silence settled like dust. Greaves didn't move. Amara sat still, back straight, until the click of Celeste's heels faded completely down the corridor. Then she exhaled. "That wasn't the real will," she said. Greaves gave the faintest smile. "No, it wasn't." He reached beneath the desk and pulled out a thick envelope. Unmarked. Heavy. He placed it in front of her. "Your father anticipated she would do this. He drafted two versions, the one filed publicly under her influence and the one protected by legal trust protocols. This contains both the trust deed and a composition." "A composition?" Amara asked, confused. Greaves nodded. "Encrypted. In musical notation. He said you would understand it." She opened the envelope slowly. Inside, a folder containing two documents. The first was straightforward. Layton Family Trust Agreement, signed 1995, amended May 2022. It listed Amara Layton as the sole beneficiary of the family estate, including the new town property, all musical works unpublished and published, and the associated royalties and licensing rights. Her heart pounded. It was all still hers. But it was the second document that stole her breath. A sheet of staff paper, handwritten in her father's script. The title read, "Opus for a Hidden Truth." It wasn't a melody. Not exactly. There were oddly placed rests. Clusters of sharp accidentals. Unusual phrasing. Time signatures that shifted erratically. But beneath it all, a rhythm and something more. A message. Greaves handed her a small, worn journal. "He said to give you this as well. He said you'd know what to do with the score when you saw page 42. She flipped through the journal, her father's rehearsal notes, sketches, scribbled harmonies. Then on page 42, she stopped. Her fingers froze. There, between annotations he'd penciled. Middle C equals alphabet cipher. 3 staves equals 3 names. Trust encoded in harmony. A cipher. Notes mapped to letters. Harmony as code. It was brilliant. And very Benjamin. That evening, back at the house, Amara walked through the front door without knocking. Celeste was seated by the window in a silk robe, swirling wine in a crystal glass. Her expression faltered when she saw the violin case in Amara's hands. "Come to claim your heirloom?" she asked dryly. "I did," Amara said, stepping into the room. "But I also came to say goodbye." Celeste laughed. "You already did that. In court." "I'm not talking about Dad." Celeste's eyes narrowed. Amara stepped closer, placing the violin case on the table. "This house, the copyrights, the estate, they're mine. Legally. All of it. His real will wasn't the one you paid for." Celeste rose, incredulous. That's impossible. He signed everything in front of my solicitor. He was dying, Amara replied, calm. You rushed him. Controlled him. But he planned ahead. He filed the trust through Greaves. And coded a message in music you'd never think to look at. Celeste's hand tightened on the wineglass. You're lying. Amara opened the violin case. Nestled inside was the instrument, dark cherry wood, its surface smoothed from years of use. She lifted it gently. Then, without a word, she began to play. The melody wasn't familiar, yet it filled the room with something ancient. There was grief in it, and defiance. And beneath each movement, the feeling of locked doors slowly opening. Celeste backed away. Amara played on. As she drew the final bow stroke, she lowered the violin and looked her stepmother directly in the eye. You were wrong, she whispered. Music isn't weakness. It remembers everything. That night, alone in the music room, Amara decoded the final measure. Trust filed. She smiled through tears. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was her father's final composition, a fugue of justice, love, and faith in his daughter's ear for truth. And now, it was her turn to finish the symphony. The fog rolled low over Edinburgh's cobbled streets as Amara stepped through the dark wood doors of Greaves and Company. The old building stood firm like a citadel against time, but inside, everything felt suspended, solemn, still, and charged. Harrison Greaves sat waiting in his study. He didn't rise to greet her, only gestured toward the same leather chair she had sat in days before, when Celeste's performance had drowned out the truth. But this was no longer Celeste's stage. This time, Amara had come for answers. Greaves leaned back slightly, then opened a folder marked, Private Holding, Leighton Trust. Miss Leighton, he began quietly, what I'm about to share with you was prepared years in advance, years before your father ever spoke a single vow to Celeste Hargrove. Amara said nothing, but her hands tensed on her lap. In April 2015, Greaves continued, your father established the Leighton Trust. It legally removed all personal and creative assets from his direct ownership. The townhouse in Newtown, the entire body of his unpublished compositions, even the letters between him and your mother, all placed in a trust, with you named as the sole beneficiary. Amara blinked. Before they married? Greaves nodded. Long before. He came to me with clarity. He didn't want love, or what he mistook for love, to cloud legacy. He told me, my daughter hears truth in silence. Let the world never rob her of it. Something caught in Amara's chest. Her throat burned. He didn't trust Celeste? He didn't distrust her, Greaves corrected. But he knew that grief makes men vulnerable. And he understood ambition when he saw it. He passed her a document. It was yellowed slightly at the edges, a sign of age, not neglect. The ink was unmistakable. Her father's sweeping signature. Her full name in type. Amara Elodie Leighton, beneficiary and custodian. She stared at it for a long time. The paper trembled in her hands. He never told me, she whispered. He didn't need to, Greaves replied. He trusted you'd find your way to the truth when the moment was right. Amara left the law office without speaking to anyone. Rain had started to fall, a light drizzle that smeared the cobblestones and silvered the air. She walked the streets of Newtown slowly, her thoughts echoing off every stone facade. By the time she reached the house, her childhood home, dusk had begun to settle. The front door creaked as she stepped inside. Celeste was gone. No note. No goodbye. Just silence. The perfume-laced silk scarves were missing from the banister. The piano bench sat empty again. Her departure, though wordless, was absolute. Amara wandered from room to room, each space once familiar, now stripped of its illusions. When she entered the drawing room, she found it as she remembered it last, hollow, cold. But on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, one thing remained untouched. A photo, framed in brass. Her and her father, side by side at the piano, her hand reaching for his as he leaned in with that signature half-smile. The past flickered like candlelight. You tried to show me, she said aloud, voice hoarse. But I wasn't ready to hear. She held the frame gently and took it upstairs to the bedroom she hadn't entered in years. That night, Amara placed the violin case on the edge of her childhood bed. The mattress still dipped in the same place. The wallpaper had faded, its musical motif now a soft ghost of what it once was. Moonlight spilled across the floor, touching the old desk where she once scribbled harmonies as a girl. She unlatched the violin case. Inside, carefully folded, was the sheet music her father had left, opus for a hidden truth. She laid it out on the desk and lit a small reading lamp. The notes danced in peculiar rhythms. Clusters, inverted clefs, measures that seemed less musical and more mechanical. But it wasn't chaotic. It was coded. She pulled her notebook close and began decoding it one note at a time, mapping tones to letters, transposing intervals into symbols. Hours passed. Rain whispered on the windows. The world shrank to the desk and the pages in front of her. Then, at the bottom corner of the final staff, a sequence emerged, not a melody, but a set of numbers. Catalog codes. Her father's personal archive. She didn't hesitate. Downstairs, in the music room behind the locked cabinet, a cedar drawer bore those numbers carved discreetly into brass. Inside, a single envelope, thick and sealed. Her name written in careful script. She opened it with reverence. My dearest Amara, I know we didn't have all the time we should have had. I know I was silent when I should have spoken. But I want you to know, every page of music I wrote after your mother passed, every note, was for you. This house is yours. This legacy. I placed it beyond reach because I feared losing the only thing that mattered. The truth we created together in this home. Let Celeste chase the lights. You, Amara, were always meant for the sound. Forgive me for not telling you in person. Let this be my final rehearsal. She clutched the letter to her chest. Her body trembled with release, not just grief, but understanding. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been protecting her all along. The next morning, the house was filled with sunlight. Amara opened the windows, every single one, until breeze and music could flow freely through the corridors once again. She returned to the music room with the violin and the decoded score. No longer a cipher. No longer a puzzle. She placed the bow gently to the strings and played. The melody rose like something ancient and alive, layered with sorrow, yes, but with triumph too. Each note sang not just of Benjamin's voice, but of her own. She played until her arms ached and her heart steadied. Then she stood, kissed the scroll of the violin and whispered, I remember now. The dining room of the new town estate had been rearranged, again. Gone were the antique candelabras and velvet drapes. In their place stood chrome fixtures, property brochures, and a glass table lined with investor portfolios. The room reeked of expensive cologne and pretension. Celeste stood at the center, a flute of champagne in hand, her smile painted wider than usual. This house, she announced with rehearsed elegance, is more than a memory, it's a future. A reimagining. Fine dining. Classical jazz in the courtyard. A wine cellar beneath the parlor. We are not just buying a property today, we are investing in cultural revival. The couple across the table, both sharp-jawed and wearing matching blazers, nodded approvingly. The man adjusted his watch. The woman flipped the contract to the signature page. Shall we? Celeste purred, extending a Mont Blanc pen across the table. And then, a slow clap. It echoed from the entryway like the final note of a sonata. Deliberate. Measured. All eyes turned. Amara stood in the doorway. Dressed in a black coat and high leather boots, violin case slung at her back like a weapon, she looked every inch the woman her father raised. Composed, relentless, and unyielding in the face of fraud. Celeste's smile faltered. What is the meaning of this? I believe, Amara said, stepping forward, this is what you might call an encore. The investors shifted uncomfortably. The woman whispered, Who is she? The daughter, Amara replied before Celeste could speak. The legal owner of this property. Celeste's face flushed then paled. She's mistaken. Everything has been arranged. With forged documents, Amara cut in smoothly. The original title and estate assets were transferred into the Leighton Trust in 2015. My father ensured his legacy wouldn't be sold off for someone's vanity restaurant. She opened a leather folder and pulled out several documents. Harrison Greaves stepped in behind her, solemn as a conductor ready to cue the first note. Greaves cleared his throat. For the record, my name is Harrison Greaves, solicitor of the late Benjamin Layton and executor of the Layton Trust. These are the original filings, certified and notarized, proving that Miss Amara Layton is the sole and legal beneficiary of the estate, including this property. The investors went still. Celeste's voice rose, trembling now. This is my home. Benjamin left it to me. No, Greaves replied, flipping to a highlighted section. He left you a generous monthly allowance, revoked upon any attempt to sell assets outside of the trust. You never owned this estate. Not for a single day. A silence fell. Only the ticking of the wall clock remained. Celeste looked between the pages, then to the signing couple, her expression folding into something grotesque, desperation dressed in pearls. You don't understand, she said, voice rising. I built plans, menus, contracts. You built them on stolen ground, Amara replied coldly. And now the concert's over. The male investor stood. We'll need to review this with our legal counsel. His partner grabbed her bag without a word. Celeste reached for them. Please wait. They walked out. The door closed behind them like the final curtain of a failed act. When they were alone, Celeste rounded on Amara. You think this makes you better than me? You think that name gives you the right to tear everything down? No, Amara said softly. But it gives me the right to protect what matters. This house was never yours to sell. Not when you gutted its music. Not when you erased my mother's portrait from the stairwell. Not when you locked my father's letters in a box and buried him with lies. Celeste stared at her. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gulps. You'll regret this, she hissed. No, Amara said. I regret staying quiet as long as I did. She walked to the window, looking out over the city. The skyline of Edinburgh shimmered beneath the gray afternoon light. I'm giving you 10 days, she said without turning around. Pack your things. This house deserves silence again. Celeste's voice cracked. Where will I go? That's not my concern, Amara said, turning back to face her. You chose your path when you tried to profit off my father's death. Now I choose mine. She walked past her stepmother, out the room and down the corridor lined with hollow spaces once filled with music. Each step felt like reclaiming a note long left unplayed. That evening, the house exhaled. Gone were the voices of investors, the scent of staged success. Amara lit a single candle on the grand piano, her father's candle, and sat on the bench that once bore his weight. She opened the violin case. She played, but not for revenge, not for triumph. She played a memory, the same piece her father taught her at age 11, fumbling through each measure as he guided her hands with patience. The same piece he played that night after her mother's funeral, when neither of them could speak. Her bow rose and fell like breath. Outside, the city went on. But inside, the house began to remember itself. The first morning Amara woke in the new town estate felt like waking in the hollow of a cathedral, grand, still, and full of echoes. Sunlight pushed gently through the high Georgian windows, casting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. The house no longer felt like it belonged to anyone else. She padded barefoot down the hallway. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was filled with possibility. Dust floated like pollen in the air as she entered the music library, once her father's sanctuary, then Celeste's unused showpiece. Books and scores still lined the upper shelves, though many were displaced. Cobwebs clung to brass lamp sconces. The polished floor had dulled from years of misuse. But in the light she saw what was left, and what could be rebuilt. She ran a finger along the spine of a weathered composition notebook, Brahms, The Late Years. Next to it was a hand-bound folder labeled Layton Originals, 1979 to 1985 in her father's elegant, slanted handwriting. Amara sat cross-legged on the floor, opening the folder with trembling hands. Inside were pages of notation, fragments of unfinished melodies, annotations scrawled in the margins. Some had tiny water stains. She recognized them immediately as the result of a glass of tea he always left too close to the page. She smiled. It wasn't just music. It was memory, alive and imperfect in hers. She hired restorers within the week. Local artisans, many of whom remembered her father's performances, offered their services at half cost or free. The grand piano, Benjamin's prized Bosendorfer, had been stored under a canvas tarp in the cold rear salon. It took 3 strong men and a specialist to lift and recondition it, revoicing the strings and polishing the faded ebony to a satin gleam. Amara stood nearby the entire time, hands clasped, breath tight, like watching a friend come out of surgery. When the final key was tuned, the technician played a C major chord. The sound filled the room, bold and unapologetic. Amara cried quietly, her shoulders shaking with gratitude. Room by room, she brought the house back to life. The faded wallpaper in the stairwell was replaced with soft gold and cream tones. She restored the portraits that had been stashed in storage. Her mother's oil painting, Margaret, young and serene with a cello in her arms, was rehung by the stairwell landing. Benjamin's black and white recital photos were framed and placed above the fireplace. But it was the library that consumed her most. She catalogued everything, working into the early hours, dust in her hair, ink on her wrists. She created a new system by genre, composer, and personal significance. Every time she placed a book on the shelf, it felt like returning a note to a forgotten chord. She made plans with a local preservation trust to digitize the handwritten compositions. The archivist, an older man named Laird, wept softly when he held the original of Elegy in B minor in his hands. This piece, he said, was performed at the Queen's Hall in 1987. I was in the audience. It was the only time I ever saw your father live. Amara touched the corner of the manuscript. He wrote it the week after my mother found out she was pregnant with me. Laird placed a hand over his heart. It makes sense. It sounds like someone discovering love in slow motion. The idea came to her one night after a dream. She had been playing the violin alone in the house, and as she finished, an unseen audience erupted into applause, not loud, but honest. And in the dream, instead of walking off stage, she stepped down into the audience and joined them. When she woke up, the idea remained. A house like this should not become a stage again. It should become a keeper of voices. She drew up the proposal herself, the Scottish House of Musical Memory, a non-profit archival and performance space dedicated to preserving the musical legacies of Scottish families, starting with the Leightons. It would house performances, yes, but also workshops. Young musicians could study here, surrounded by centuries of sound. Retired musicians could donate their scores. Families could visit and listen to a father's waltz written in 1944 or a grandmother's lullaby in the Highland dialect. It would become more than a monument. It would be a home again. Late one evening, with most of the work complete, Amara climbed the narrow stairwell to the attic, a space she hadn't entered since she was a teenager. The air was dry and still. Boxes lined the walls. She found one labeled 1994 Summer. Opening it revealed a worn sketchbook, childlike drawings, pressed flowers, and a cassette tape with a sticky note on it. For Amara, age 7. She stared at it, heart skipping. Back downstairs, she dusted off an old cassette player, inserted the tape, and pressed play. White noise. Hello, my star. Her father's voice crackled from the speakers. It's summer. You just learned your first scale. This recording is for you. When you're older, if you ever doubt, if you ever forget, I want you to remember this sound. Piano keys. Fumbling. Tiny giggles. Then a note, clear, high, uncertain. Her own. She remembered now. That summer afternoon. Her tiny hands slipping on the keys. Her father's laugh as he played a note and let her echo it back. Over and over. She had forgotten. Now it returned like a song you never knew you knew. That night, she lit a single candle in the music room. She sat at the piano and placed the tape beside her. With the room empty and full all at once, she began to play. A slow, reverent melody. Not one from her father's book, but one she was composing now. For him, for her, for the home that had finally learned how to sing again. The key to the wine cellar had always hung behind a rusted nail under the stairwell, a detail only someone who grew up here would remember. Amara found it again one quiet afternoon, tucked inside a cracked ceramic vase her mother once used for wildflowers. She held the cold iron key in her palm for a long time before walking down into the dark. The air in the cellar was thick with thyme, earth and oak, leather and shadow. Shelves lined the walls, though most of the wine bottles were long gone. In the far corner, behind a dusty violin case, she noticed something odd, a small wooden chest with brass latches. It wasn't locked. Inside lay a velvet pouch, a spool of ribbon tapes, and a note sealed in wax. She sat on the stone floor and unfolded it with shaking hands. "My dear Amara, if you found this, it means you've listened deeply, not just with your ears, but with your heart. This box contains a piece of our beginning, your mother's and mine. On the night I asked for her hand in marriage, I composed a short piece, not grand, not complex, just true. I played it for her in this very room, under a single oil lamp. She said yes before the final note ended. I recorded it, though I never performed it publicly. It was hers. It was ours. And now it is yours. You asked me once if music dies when no one listens. No, my darling. It doesn't die. It transforms. It waits for the right hands to lift it again. I believe in yours. With all my love." Amara blinked hard, pressing the note against her heart. She retrieved an old cassette player from the study upstairs. With careful fingers, she inserted the labeled tape, for M. The hiss of static filled the room, then a soft, intimate piano melody, hesitant at first, then flowing like a whispered promise. It wasn't flashy. There were no flourishes. But it was honest, vulnerable. She could imagine her mother's eyes shimmering in that cellar glow. She could hear her father's breath between chords, the way he leaned into feeling rather than perfection. Tears slipped silently down Amara's cheeks. This was what had been hidden. Not just music. Days later, the museum opened beneath overcast skies. But inside, every room shimmered. The Scottish House of Musical Memory had come to life. The music library had been restored to its full glory, manuscripts encased in glass. Listening booths had been installed, where visitors could hear rare recordings, including selections of Benjamin's unpublished works. A portrait wall celebrated composers from all corners of Scotland, including a new addition, Margaret Leighton, cellist, teacher, muse. Celeste had not returned. Amara had not pressed charges. No court proceedings. No media spectacle. Only silence. And that was punishment enough. Forgiveness had not come easily. But it had come, not as a gift to Celeste, but as a release for herself. Carrying hatred, she realized, only continued the theft. She would not let anyone rob her of peace again. The concert hall was small but elegant. Carved wood, candlelight, and a single Bosendorfer centered on the stage. The audience included former students of her father's, scholars, curious locals, and musicians from across the country. The room buzzed with reverence. Amara stood backstage, violin in hand, dressed in black silk. A thin braid tucked behind her ear, just like her mother used to wear. The final piece of the evening was one the audience had never heard. Symphony No. 5, The Last Note, by Benjamin Leighton. Unpublished. Unplayed. Until now. She stepped onto the stage. The applause hushed. She nodded once to the chamber ensemble, raised her bow, and began. The first movement opened with a single sustained note, low, trembling, like a question. It climbed cautiously into a theme both familiar and new. Echoes of Benjamin's style emerged, melancholic strings, delicate piano undercurrents, a hidden cello line that mourned and soared all at once. Midway, Amara felt something shift. She was no longer performing. She was speaking. With each measure, she spoke her grief, her memory, her forgiveness. The second movement was quiet, a lullaby, maybe, or an apology. Listeners leaned forward, breath held. Someone in the third row wept. And the final movement? Oh, the final movement. It burst open like spring after a hard winter. Lush, confident, luminous. Not just her father's voice. Hers. When the last note faded, the room stayed silent. Then applause. Not loud. Not explosive. But full. Honest. Just like the music. Afterward, Amara stood in the garden behind the museum. Night had settled softly over Edinburgh. She looked up at the stars, one hand still clutching the neck of her violin, the other tucked inside her coat. Beside the reflecting pool stood a small plaque. This house is not just brick and wood. It is echo and breath. It is where music waits to be remembered. She closed her eyes. A breeze stirred the trees. No ghosts remained. Only legacy. And the gentle rhythm of someone finally coming home.